Good morning, colleagues. My name is Ibrahim Okumu. I'm from Makerere University in Uganda. This morning, after listening to colleagues speak about the new developments and what's going to take place in the future of finance research, we're now going to listen to the gurus in the space of firms. The speaker for today is going to be Verhoogen, who is a professor of economics and international and public affairs at Columbia University. Eric does research in the fields of development economics, international trade, and labor economics. We shall equally listen to two respondents. That is Christopher Woodruff, who is a professor of development economics and a fellow at Wolfson College, University of Oxford. Chris's research focuses on enterprises in low-income countries and is equally the pioneer of field experiments in farms. The other respondent, Jonas, Hjort, is a professor of economics at University College London, and Johannes's research is on farms, public sector organizations, and workers in developing countries. Eric, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. Thanks very much to the organizers for having me on the program. It's an honor to be here. I would like to also say thank you for putting a session called Firms on the program. I think that, even just a few years ago in a conference like this, we wouldn't have had such a session. And that's actually the first couple of slides I'm going to talk about that and then give a sort of progress report on where we are in this area. Once upon a time, growth was at the core of development economics. If you go back and you read the sort of greatest hits in development economics back for World War II, just following World War II, a lot of it, not 100%, but a lot of it was about growth, and in particular about how do you get industrialization going in a developing country. I've listed a bunch of sort of classic references. There were lots of good ideas there. They weren't all formalized, but there was a round of formalization of those ideas in endogenous growth models in the 1980s and 1990s. And then by the time I was in graduate school, Seema and I mentioned this, Seema and I were in the same cohort. Basically by that time, growth had basically disappeared from PhD syllabi in development. There was very little conversation about growth within development. What happened? Partly what happened is the credibility revolution that in applied micro, generally there's much more attention to causal identification. There were development of quasi-experimental and experimental methods. There was sort of suspicion of grand narratives. The growth literature didn't have much to offer empirically. There are lots of interesting models, but the empirical work is basically limited to cross-country growth regressions. And there, I think lots of people in this room would agree it's hard to defend causal interpretation on the basis of such regressions. And so, the focus shifted to questions that could be convincingly answered in microdata. That's generated lots of progress, as this conference is attesting. But my view, and I think the view that is common to many people working in this area is, to really move the needle on poverty, we can't avoid these bigger questions about growth and about what makes some countries richer and some countries poor. And so that's how I see, it's somewhat idiosyncratic, but that's how I see this area of firms in development, is it's trying to bring these two streams together, both applied micro methods and sort of an applied micro sensibility of transparency in the handling of data, hands above the table in terms of understanding exactly what's going on and what's generating identification, and this focus on drivers of growth, on things that we think really will move the needle at this more aggregate level. In particular, though, literature is focusing on micro of firms. What are the determinants of innovative behavior by firms, and including productivity, and where by innovative behavior, I'm using this in a slightly more general way than people often do. What I mean is I want to include catch-up, not just stuff that's new to the world, but stuff that's new to firms. And so I use the word upgrading all the time. You guys are probably tired of hearing me use the word, but I like the word because it includes this catch-up element as well as stuff that's new to the world. Happily, I think this area seems to be sort of cohering as a subfield of development, and that's partly why I think we're on the program here today. I want to do a shout out to people who have, contributed public goods to the formation of this subfield. Robin Burgess, I don't know if he's there's Robin in the room, and Chang started this series of conferences on industrial development. That was, for me, formative, and I think for many other people, formative. The IGC, the National Growth Center, has played an important role, both with conferences and with funding. And I also want to give Chris a lot of credit. Petal has been a huge amount of work. I've taken on a little bit of that work, and so I can testify just how much work it is, and that's really been important for developing this area. The area has also benefited from growing availability of microdata, tremendous policymaker interest, and a growing willingness of governments and NGOs and funders to support experiments at the firm level. So today I'll try and give a sort of progress report highlighting some areas where I think both progress has been made and there's more to do. It's less thorough than some of the talks that we've seen already. Partly, I guess, in my defense, it's a little bit of a thinner area, I think, than some of the other areas. It's not quite as mature, but it'll be more. My selection will be somewhat idiosyncratic and not quite as thorough. I'm going to talk about 4 areas: knowledge spillovers, what I'm calling demand pull effects, contractual frictions in upgrading, and then management practices. Okay. I sort of said that. I'm drawing on, I have a recent JEL review, which says many of the things I'm going to say in more detail, and I would refer you to that. So first, knowledge spillovers. These are really core, both to thinking about growth, going back, you have the Romer and Lucas models. Also, Hausman and Roderick's ideas about self-discovery are a lot about these knowledge or learning externalities, knowledge spillovers, whatever name you want to give. Also, for arguments for industrial policy, these are central. And my sense is that the literature is pretty thin on these. When you're talking about firms, we're aware that there's lots of social effects are difficult to identify. That's going back to Mansky. There's been a lot of work, I should say, in agriculture and other areas, just not on firms. Let me highlight. Chris is sitting out there in the. I see still having coffee. I wanted to give credit. I really love this pineapples paper. I think it's a seminal paper in this literature where you can separate the geographic neighborhood from the information neighborhood. The idea is that the common unobservables are common in the geographic neighborhood, not necessarily in the information neighborhood. And I think that's a great. Anyway, I think it's an important paper that we're building off of. There's a bunch of other work by other people in the room. I won't go, for reasons of time, I won't go through all of them, but you see Mujfik, Esser, Oriana, and others have made important contributions here. One paper I do want to talk in a little bit of detail about is this paper by Jing Tsai, I guess you would say, and Adam Seidel about where they've been able to, among firms in China, and they were able to experimentally manipulate the network. So they enormous number of firms in one city in China, 2,800 firms. They got them to meet, or the treated firms to meet once a month to talk about business. They find these enormous effects. So here the graphic is just from VoxDev, but essentially something like 8 or 10%, depending on if you're looking at medium run or the sort of the end line or sort of in the middle on revenues. They also find effects on profits, on employment, on assets, on utility costs, and on TFP. Just from these meetings, those are very impressive effects, much larger than I would be sort of positively inclined to believe these things would have expected to find. I want to also highlight. So Marcel Fachon and Simon Quinn have a paper where they're tried something similar, smaller sample size, not as quite as intensive a manipulation, and with smaller effects. The other thing I think is very nice about this paper is they seeded different types of information. So they seeded 2 types of opportunities with the government. One was a grant opportunity where arguably firms were competing for the same grant, and the other was a savings opportunity for managers, which is arguably not non-rival. And it turned out diffusion was, so the information got passed about the non-rival opportunity, got passed more than about the rival opportunity, and especially when there were fewer competitors. So when there were more competitors in your group, that rival information was even less likely to be passed. So I think it's very clean evidence, basically, that knowledge is flowing between firms in this network. Also, shout out to Morgan Hardy and Jamie Buchanan have related work sort of reinforcing that idea that you're less likely to share information with with competitors. Just some open questions. In this literature, I think we need lots more work on knowledge spillovers. This is not yet about, the spillovers here are not directly about production technologies, so I think we would like to see more exactly on production technologies. So far we have effects of sales, sales and profits. Those could reflect sort of networking benefits, not necessarily knowledge flows, and so I think we need more work to sort of unpack that. And then the big question in this whole area is whether the spillovers are large enough, getting back to the industrial policy idea, whether the spillovers are large enough to actually justify public subsidies. So I hope you see more in that area coming up. Okay, second point about demand pull effects. So this is, whereas the knowledge spillover is actually central to thinking about growth, this idea of demand pull effects, and what I mean is essentially non-homotheticity in demand and how who you're selling to may matter for how much upgrading there is. That's something that's been less central to growth, partly because of this tradition in the growth literature about modeling, individual countries in isolation, or not so much thinking about where the goods are being sold. It's also for technical reasons that sort of non-homotheticity in demand are hard to model tractably, although there's been some progress on that. Papers by Matsuyama and Diego Comín and Lashkari and Mestieri. Even the papers that have focused on export orientation, on the effects of exporting, have tended to focus on what I would call supply side issues, on productivity effects or scale effects, rather than what is the nature of demand doing. But I think that there's now been an accumulation of work on these demand effects that is consistent, and I think is adding up to the sort of more than the sum of its parts. This is an old idea in trade. I'm sort of pandering to the Swedes in the audience by noticing that it's usually called the Linder hypothesis, but it's actually Bernstein-Linder, or went by Bernstein-Linder. An old idea that had been explored in the trade literature, but not so much at the firm level. I think. Partly, we had the permission to go back 20 years, so I can cite previous work of mine way back in 2008, which was showing basically which is emphasizing how the quality composition within a firm depends on the destination market. So there's a Volkswagen factory in Mexico. It had been there since the 1960s. It was producing high-quality varieties, including the new Beetle, as well as the old Beetles, were these sort of low-quality varieties. Almost all the low-quality varieties were sold domestically. The high-quality ones were sold mostly in the U.S., but also other countries. This graph is showing the light gray is just the export share in this one factory. I'm just using this as an example. So both because the domestic market shrank and because the export market increased, you see a shift. You see an increase in export share, and then you also see a shift towards these high-quality varieties. So the omitted category in the dark black line would be the old Beetle, which went from about 40% down to about 10%. It turned out that that's quite general in manufacturing, using ISO 9000 as a proxy for quality and looking at wages. That effect, using basically a triple difference design, I was able to show that effect was. It seemed to be quite general, and then subsequent work has showed we couldn't do it. I couldn't do it in Mexico, but if you look at, you can separate using countries that export to more different countries. You can show that, Rand and Brambilla co-authors, and then another paper of mine, we showed that it's not just exports per se. It doesn't seem to be scale, but actually, the income of the destination seems to matter. But one thing I didn't do, and it's basically for convenience, I modeled these as shifts between products that firms already know how to produce. And what subsequent work has shown is that there's actually the learning involved in that process. Also, Amit's here. This is another great paper by David Atkin and Adam Osman and Amit, where in Egypt, producers of rugs, they randomized initial export contracts. Right. So for these guys, there wasn't a persistent intervention. It was just a one-time. Here's an export contract for rugs sold to rich country buyers. They also tracked detailed quality indicators, and I think a very smart thing, very clever thing to do was ask these producers to come into a lab and produce products using identical specifications. This table, I hope you can see it. It's large and it's a little bit small, but essentially I do have a light here. So these are all dimensions of quality. Then you just have the intent to treat effects and the treatment on the treated. Basically, this initial export contracts led to persistent increases in the quality of the rugs that these guys were producing. It's quite robust. And then when you look at the rugs produced in the lab, they find, even though the specifications and the request was identical, they find that these guys who had received the export contracts were more likely to produce higher quality rugs. And the last table, if you can see that, is at using no more time. So they basically produced rugs that had more attributes without taking more time. That sure looks, and it's convincing to me that it looks like higher, that they've learned something in the process. They also tracked communications between an intermediary that was working with them and the producers, and they find that the learning happened precisely on those dimensions on which there had been communication. Another paper in this area I want to highlight is this paper by Isabella Manalici, and can't remember Alfaro Urena's first name, and Jose Vasquez, which was selling to multinationals in Costa Rica, also drove upgrading. So they're using here firm-to-firm data from the tax system. That's an important frontier, I think, in this work on firms that we never used to know who was doing business with whom. Now we're seeing that in many countries, and so I think that's opening up a whole new range of research questions. Their design is basically a matching design, comparing firms that start supplying to a multinational versus firms that don't start supplying to a multinational or start supplying to other sorts of firms. My favorite comparison is this one where in the graph they're comparing firms that start supplying to multinationals to firms that start supplying to Costa Rican domestic exporters, which are sort of the larger, more sophisticated domestic firms. And you can see there, and this is just an event study, and it's here we have sales to other firms, not to the main customer, but to other firms. There's a capacity constraint. You can see that in the first year, sales overall to other firms goes down, but then quite quickly it recovers, and actually in the MNC case, it more than recovers. So sales go up even above where they were before, and those new customers of the MNCs tend to be larger. They tend to have higher export and import shares. They tend to have longer relations with suppliers. They're sort of better buyers, and so it sure looks like suppliers are learning from these interactions with multinational corporations. Partly that's a reputation effect, but they did a bunch of qualitative sort of surveys also where these suppliers talked about how stringent the multinationals were and how much they had to change their practices in order to appeal to them. And so I skipped over, there was a bullet point there, but essentially saying demanding customers can pull the upgrading process. And I think we're seeing that consistently across a bunch of different studies. Let me just mention quickly also, there's a paper that just came out in January in the JPE, Banu Demir and Cecilia Fiedler and Daniel Shu and Yang, again using firm-to-firm data, this one in Turkey, where they basically had kind of a shift share design. So when the Turkish firm starts selling to Germany, not only do their own wages go up, that's consistent with the previous work, but they start sourcing from suppliers that themselves have higher wages. So that sure looks like they're sourcing from higher quality suppliers, and so it's almost like a second order demand pull effect through the value chain. Some open questions in this literature. I think it'd be great to have more work. Our learning effects, which Adam and Amit and David documented, are those especially strong at the high end of industries, at the high quality end. That's my intuition, but there are not a lot of studies that I could point to say, this is what's going on. And if so, if it turns out that that's the case, why is that the case? You hear a lot now, also, Danny Rajka has been pushing this, Daron Asamoah has been pushing this about inappropriate technologies, about whether, in a developing country that has a lot of unskilled labor, shouldn't you be using, technologies that are more intensive on unskilled labor? And the high quality end, usually often firms are using technologies that have been developed in rich countries that have, in places that have different factor proportions. Okay, and so there's a question of whether this upgrading, which generally seems like a good thing and generate learning, but it may lead to the use of particularly inappropriate technologies. And so there's a tension there. I think we don't know really what's the right way to go, or I don't have a good clear intuition about what's the right way to go on that. But it's something that I think would be worthy of more study. I've got to speed up just a little bit. Okay, a third area. Here where I think we made some progress, but there's still more to do, is about contractual frictions in upgrading, sort of agency issues or asymmetric information around innovative behavior. Here's another paper, again with Amit and with David and with Azam Chowdhury and Shamaila Chowdhury in Pakistan. Apologies to those of you who've seen this before. We were focusing on the soccer ball sector. In Pakistan, we came up with a new technology, basically as close to a no-brainer technology as I think we've seen. No-brainer in the sense that a soccer ball has hexagons and pentagons. The main input is these sheets of artificial leather that are the exterior of the ball. That's about 50% of cost once they're treated. You can see there on the left is the old pentagon die that was being used, and then the second image is of the Rexon after pentagons have been cut out using these old pentagon dies. There's more, okay, so minimizing waste is a key objective. That way of cutting pentagons was not the optimal way of cutting pentagons. There's a math paper in 1990. This is not where we learned about it, but it turns out that there's mathematicians know about this, about packing. There's a whole branch of mathematics of which I was ignorant before I started working on this, about packing problems. So using that, essentially we used that design, and my wife, whose name is Annalisa Guzzini, was shared credit for coming up with this innovation. We came up with a new die, so it's the one on the right that implements this superior packing of pentagons. So you can get about 8% more pentagons per sheet than under the previous way of cutting. So we thought this is great. We were trying to keep it secret. We thought this is going to spread so quickly, it's going to spread like wildfire. We have to be very, very sophisticated about not revealing this information. It turned out almost nobody adopted it once we gave it out. Enough adopted that we knew it was working, but almost nobody adopted it. Why not? We went and we asked people, and what they by far the main answer was our workers don't like the die. Our workers are resisting. In retrospect, it was clear what was going on. The workers are paid piece rate. They're paid per ball, essentially, or per hexagon, per pentagon, per ball. And our die was slowing them down. They didn't know. We found out later that that basically within about a month they could get back up to speed, but they didn't know that, and so they were resisting. And essentially, they didn't say, hey, pay me a little bit more and I'll adopt the technology. What they said is, this is bad technology. And then the firms, they had us kind of crazy people coming and telling them about this die, and then they had their workers along standing and telling them it was terrible, and they mostly ended up not adopting. We sort of were able to establish that by running a second experiment where we gave the workers a month's bonus, which was not very much money, to demonstrate that the die was working in the presence of the owner. When they did that, the firms adopted. Okay, why do I think that's important? There's several different implications, but one is, which I think is interesting and relevant, is that the piece rates in the technologically static environment that existed before we came. For many years, the technology hadn't changed. In that situation, a piece rate seemed like the optimal way of extracting effort and seemed like the optimal way of producing. But then once there's a new idea in town, it turned out those piece rates got in the way. Okay, and I'll come back to that when I talk about management practice. So it's not obvious that like the high-powered incentives of the piece rates was the right labor contract in this new environment once the new ideas were around. Okay, another paper I want to talk about, Jonas and Jean-Marc Leon and Chris Hansman and Mathieu Tichou have a paper on Peruvian fish meal plants where they have, again, they're looking at the effects of increased quality demands. So in this case, instrumented nicely by quotas for other countries that produce high-quality fish meal, where in this case, fish meal, the quality is basically observable. It's the protein content of the fish meal. I should turn this way. I realize I'm sorry for discriminating against this side of the room. So what happens when exogenously the demand for high-quality fish meal goes up? These producers buy boats. They buy boats. They vertically integrate with the fishing boats. Why is that? Essentially, the freshness of the fish is not observable at the dock. Okay, and so by buying the boats, they could then ensure that those boats didn't go too far out, and when they came back, the fish were fresher. And so arguably what's happening is that the vertical integration allows the firms to solve this quality assurance problem, to reduce that information asymmetry at the dock. It suggests, I guess, kind of indirectly suggesting that this quality assurance problem, this asymmetric information about quality kind of within the supply chain is an important constraint on the upgrading process. Okay, let me just say how I'm going to skip over this very quickly. Basically, to say there's some promising research areas. Rocco Rachiavello and Amit Morjari have an interesting paper sort of looking at the interaction of repeated interactions and relational contracts with market structure, basically showing that more competition isn't necessarily good. It may undermine relational contracts. That's, I think, an area where a lot of interesting work could be done. A couple of good papers on where the monitoring technology, this is Kelly et al. Is with Matatus in Nairobi, or Govin de Rochambeau with trucks in Liberia. That's how that's changing contracts. Again, reducing these information asymmetries. And then Natalia Rigol and Ben Roth have an interesting paper. This is in microfinance. Essentially, microfinance officials were hoarding their best clients because then they're sort of measured on the performance of their client base, and so they don't necessarily want to graduate their best clients, and they show it experimentally that seems to be the case. Okay, management practices. This has been an extremely influential literature, this work following Bloom and Van Reenen in 2007 QJE, and then the Bloom, David McKenzie, and others paper in QJE. So to the extent that now, working in this firms area, I often hear people say, why is productivity low or why is growth low in developing countries? It's bad management. I think this is an important literature, and I think it's obviously made a huge mark in lots of different areas. I also think the results have been, the findings have been somewhat misinterpreted, and so I want to try and give a different interpretation of what's happening in that literature. In this JEL review I mentioned, I've got a simple framework where basic idea, firms have inherent capabilities that have to be homegrown. You can't just go out and buy capabilities on the market. You have to develop them internally, and so that becomes a constraint. Like at a given time, you're sort of constrained by how much know-how you have, how much capabilities you have at that time. And then, given those capabilities, and based on market conditions, you choose your inputs and your products and your techniques and how much you're going to invest in learning. So in that framework, what management is actually has three components. There's three things going on. One is entrepreneurial ability, which you can think of that as part of capabilities. One is the skills of managers, and those are inputs. So you can go out and hire, maybe be able to hire high-quality managers. And then the other is management practices. And management practices are a subset of techniques. Right? Those are techniques that are chosen by entrepreneurs subject to the constraints. And so I put this in italics just because I think this is maybe a key point of what I'm trying to say. So management practices are not a primitive. Management practices are we should think about the choice of management practice in the way we think of the way we think of the choice of other techniques. Okay? And so I'm in good company by saying that. John Van Reenen has published that, or other people, and Nick Bloom in other work has said, yes, we want to think of these management practices as a technology. But that means then you can't just say bad management practices are the reason for poor performance. You've got to think about why are firms, choosing these practices. Now, one big advantage of this. I think of this literature has been to improve measurement. I think it's been brilliant, basically, improvements in measurement. Both these World Management Survey, where these long, open-ended discussions with firms trying to figure out and coding on many dimensions of what practices they're using. These sort of closed-ended or multiple choice questions have been added to many surveys, many censuses, or or large-scale surveys in many countries. And then Chris and David McKenzie also have work sort of tailoring these questions to SMEs and making them appropriate. So I think that's all great. And I think a big advantage of this is that, unlike most sectors, that you can ask a technology survey, you have to do it a very narrow set of firms, right? There's particular technologies that are only applicable at a small set of firms, whereas management practices, essentially all firms. Many firms have to use these management practices, and so you can compare across large sectors and across countries. And so that's been a big advantage. I think a question, though, that hasn't been fully answered, and it's a little bit glossed over sometimes, is that, are some management practices better than others? And the vertical view, which is often called the vertical view, which is the one that I think Nick and John and others sort of leading this literature have, is that, yes, some practices are better than others. There's good ones and there's bad ones, and we should get people to adopt the good ones. There's a long tradition in the management literature of what I call the horizontal or contingency or the design view, which is it depends on the context. It depends on what the market conditions are. It depends on what products you're selling. It depends on how much know-how you have. And so this is ultimately an empirical question. I don't think it's yet resolved. Some practices, I would agree. Like you should track your inventories. That seems like a no-brainer. So like offset pentagons, it seems like it's clearly that's a good technology that firms were not necessarily adopting. In other cases, though, when you think about performance pay, or the soccer balls is also an example of how high-powered incentives may not be the best thing, right? And so we shouldn't necessarily say like, performance pay we have to have performance pay. You're making a mistake if you're not adopting performance pay. Okay, and normally when we look at other technology, we look out in the world and we see some firms are using one technology, some firms are using another technology. We don't say one set of firms is making a mistake, other set of firms is doing it correctly. We say, I wonder what it is, what constraints these firms are facing that's leading them to choose technologies in this way. Okay, so let me talk about this Does Management Matter paper very briefly. I've got 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Okay, so let me just, I guess I'll just say, they had the randomized consulting services. These consultants camped out for 4 months in a subset of firms. They found management practices improved in their way, so they adopted more of the ones that the firms had adopted, that the researchers identified as good. That had positive effects on quality. So quality defects clearly decreased. That was a big effect. Clearly, there was some learning that went on. I think that's very important. We could, these firms learn from these consultants. There are a couple of issues. One is exclusion restriction. These guys were camped out for 4 months. Did they have some effect besides just on those 38 practices that they're tracking that might have affected? And the timing is, just for reason, I won't say much about that, but the timing is sort of off for saying it's actually the practices, the quality effects declined before there was a big separation in terms of practices. And so I think the jury's still out on whether these practices themselves are actually what was having the positive effect, or is it some other effect of the consulting? And so I think we need really a literature, or we need more studies on this, where we identify particular practices or even bundles of practices where we, either we randomize them or we find exogenous variation in those practices, and we evaluate what effects those practices are having, and we evaluate what practices are having in different contexts. Okay, to see whether is it the case. So there's a couple of papers. Again, I don't have time, but have taken on particular practices and tried to evaluate their effects. So I think we need much more of that. Chris, I think, is going to talk more about what are the best ways to deliver training and advice. There's a big literature on that, and so maybe I'll skip it. My last minute. Let me say closing thoughts about industrial policy. And again, this is kind of meta comments in a way. So my sense is that research programs tend to be most successful when they're in sustained dialogue with an audience of implementers. Okay? In this case, for this literature, the implementers, I think, or particularly industrial policy makers in many countries, of which there are a lot. There are a lot of people out there wondering, what to do. The policy pendulum is swinging back towards state intervention. After a long time in the wilderness, industrial policy is back. It's back in the US and Europe in a big way. It never left in China. There's been, it's unabated in China. WTO rules had previously constrained a lot low and middle income countries. Everyone's ignoring WTO rules now, so it's not clear that that's going to be a constraint anymore. I think that the need for a green transition is going to accelerate this also, this push towards what sort of interventions can we do in order to promote upgrading and promote innovative behaviors. In some sense, this whole pendulum swing has happened too fast. Like, our literature is not yet there. So we don't yet have, in my view, sort of a body of evidence-based recommendations to make. And so my last point is we need to hurry up and generate some. We need a lot more work on this, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work in industrial policy, so we can make sort of intelligent statements to policymakers, to this policy audience, which I think is out there, is thirsty for these results about what they should be doing and what actually we think might work. One last point is, I'm all in favor of RCTs. I'm trying to do more of them. They're very long and expensive form of information gathering, and so I think we shouldn't throw out the quasi-experimental approaches, which are a little faster and might be able to respond in real time, or not real time, but slightly less extended time to this demand that's out there about what we should be doing in terms of smart industrial policy. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric, once again. And the first respondent is Christopher Woodruff. Please, 15 minutes for you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to start by saying thanks to the organizers as well. And one on my to-do list last week was to email Emily and get her slides, and I failed to do that and so she's covered some of what I was going to cover, so I have a new slide here that I'm going to add in as I go. But I want to, first of all, I mean, Eric has done, as Eric said, I think this is a new literature that's kind of coming, a new field that's kind of coming together and cohesion. There's a bit more cohesion in it now. He's done, I think, an excellent job talking about particularly larger firms and innovation on the large firm size. And so, if we think of large firms, and the reason we might do that is large firms are arguably the engine of growth. So if we think of large firms as the engine of growth, maybe we should think of microenterprises as the bicycle rickshaws of growth. They're not as fast, they're not as sleek, but there are a lot of them. And actually, if you stand and watch them, they're pretty impressive in their own way. So I think I want to say something about small firms. I want to give the microenterprises some love. One reason is, although the large firms might be the engine of growth. Most of, as we heard yesterday, most of employment is in microenterprises and small firms. So this is a slide from a World Bank report, Wendy Cunningham and Cunningham and Bodewig, that 75% of the working age urban sub-Saharan Africans work in the informal sector. That's largely true in India and South Asia as well. And so this may not be the engine of growth, but I think it is a place where there's been quite substantial research over the last 20 years, and where I think we've learned a lot. In fact, the literature on microenterprises is vast and largely grounded in RCTs. It's a function both of the prominence of their prominence in the economy, but also the ease in finding samples. I'll come back to at the end where I think some of the research is missing in firms that are less common in the economy and not big enough to study as an individual firm, and therefore makes it much more difficult. But nearly everyone who does research on microenterprises at some point asks themselves, why are they all selling the same thing? Why are they just kind of mimic each other? Why is there no innovation at the firm level in terms of even products and things like that? In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on an angle related to innovation a bit later in my remarks, but in the interest of time, I want to do a whirlwind tour of 4 points, and the first is going to be finance, which has already really been covered. So I'll go through that quite quickly. But I think there's a fair amount of research from different places, and taking Dean's point of no single paper should be overemphasized too much, but at least on returns to capital and the evidence is not completely uniform, but there's a fair amount of evidence that returns to capital are fairly high. But there's also evidence that the returns are particularly high for a small sector of the microenterprises, and this is from Abhijit Nestor's work, but I could have put up similar graphs from work that David and I have done in Ghana and Sri Lanka, where we see that it's the upper tail that really have the highest returns, and that's where the returns are. So this is really what Emily's already covered. So I'll go through this quite quickly and focus a little bit more on the bit that I've put in that's different from what came up in the finance. So the first question is, can we identify the people at the upper end? And again, I think Emily talked about the Hussam Roth and Regold paper that I think is one way of doing this. Business plan competitions are quite common in the countries where we work. David McKenzie has a paper from Nigeria, quite a large-scale business plan competition where he's able to randomize recipients of a cash grant of $50,000, so a large number of enterprises, a very large cash reward for winning this business plan competition. At the very top end, the competition picks the winners, but just below that, David was able to convince them that, okay, you might know who the very best people in this competition are, but once we get down to the next level, you really are not quite clear who should win and who shouldn't. So let's randomize within that next cohort of firms, and with that randomization, he's able to show that the large grant, maybe not entirely surprisingly, has an effect on the growth of firms and employment. And the employment effects, he now has a longer-term follow-up from this. The employment effects diminish a bit over time, but they're still there 6 or 8 years after after the competition. So if we can identify the firms, can we provide them more capital? Again, this is a paper that Emily's already talked about, so I won't say more about that. But it seems with some caveats in that paper about heterogeneity in the outcomes of taking larger grants, that at least some firms are able to absorb larger grants. How do we deal with risk? And I think this is an area where, again, I think I would echo the points, the comment that Emily made, that this is an area I think that's exciting. There's a lot of new research on kind of revenue-based, risk-sharing kinds of contracts, microequity revenue-based contracts. I'd point out here a list at the end of this, a new platform that the UK's Development Finance Institution has in Ghana, which is revenue-based finance. Revenue-based finance actually is fairly common in the venture capital. So at slightly larger firms where maybe where accounting tends to be more formal, where the measurement issues are less of an issue, this is something that's been around for a while, and it's been used as a sort of risk-sharing, return-sharing, self-liquidating type of quasi-equity that investors can use in markets where IPOs are not going to be an issue are not going to be an option of getting out. So I think a general comment I'd make is I think the venture capital literature has the venture capital markets have part of kind of what, if we think about smaller firms, we should be trying to do is kind of take the lessons from what venture capital is doing and figure out how you get those down to smaller and smaller firms, how we use digital technology and so forth to make those appropriate for smaller firms. On training, I think much more modest positive effects to training. David's review in 2020, the VoxDev Lit that David and I and others edit, has a meta-analysis not as extensive as the one Dean talked about, but that shows that there is, in a meta-analysis sense, a positive, a significant effect, but it's fairly small. On the other hand, the costs of these programs are small, so the cost benefit might be still quite substantial. This doesn't take into account publication bias. We may be overstating that effect. It may be overwhelmed by heterogeneity. This is a place, I think, where there's huge amounts of heterogeneity. I cite one study from South Africa where I think there are several things that are different about that. One is it focuses more on marketing, less on operations. And secondly, they set out, in the design, they made it harder for firms to get in. So there's arguably kind of more self-selection of who comes into that training program, but has much more stronger effects. Mentoring, I find an interesting and promising intervention. It may be quite difficult to scale. Again, Eric mentioned the project from China. There's another from Brooks, Donovan, and Johnson. And then, again, Eric mentioned the paper by Steve Anderson and Dave McKenzie on insourcing and outsourcing. It sort of says, maybe training at least at a slightly larger size firm. Those are kind of, let's think of in the range of 5 to 10, 5 to 15 workers at a slightly larger size firm. Maybe the traditional kind of ILO training is not what we want to do, that we want to get these firms to use the market, and we want to understand why the market for consulting services is not working the way it might be, and they find that insourcing and outsourcing are much more effective and less costly than full-on consulting, and roughly comparable to costs of training, but much more effective. Then finally, on labor and marketing, and again, this came up yesterday in one of the conversations one of the discussions, that labor, there really isn't a lot of evidence that any of these interventions get firms to scale up. This is a graph from the project that Suresh Demel, David McKenzie, and I did in Sri Lanka, where we gave people subsidies for hiring new workers over a window of time. You lower the marginal cost of worker, the firms hire more workers. you take away the subsidy, they let go of all those workers. It looks to us like in that they really understand what the marginal product of labor is, and they're basically hiring up to the point where the marginal product of labor equals the marginal cost, and there's not a lot of effect. And I think the other projects that have programs that have thought about either training workers or training firms have generally not found much going on in the way of labor. Marketing, I think, is an interesting area. Steve Anderson and others from London Business School and Cambridge have done work on that area. And then finally, I wanted to say on really, I guess this relates to training, but also selection. There's been less work on slightly larger, more growth-oriented firms, and there's a massive ecosystem out there of incubators and accelerators. The venture capital people will all swear that these work, that these are very important, that they work, that they work, and that they're effective. There's a small literature on this, which is, and part of the problem is that it's very difficult to figure out how to randomize entry into these. They generally want to select the people they select, but Gonzalez-Uribe and Leatherby and Gonzalez-Uribe and Reyes have a couple interesting papers, one from Startup Chile, which is basically an RD design, but Startup Chile is a massive program, so the bands around the discontinuity are not as bad as they are in some of the smaller programs, and then the Gonzalez-Uribe and Reyes have a project in Colombia where they take advantage of a mistake, in a sense, by the competition in not standardizing the judge ratings so that the people who, the applicants who got tough judges are less likely to get into the program, conditional on quality, compared to the people who got easy judges, and find that both of those papers find that these programs have effects on survival, on access to capital, and on revenues. So I think there's a lot more that could be done in that area. These are for sort of really scaling up the more dynamic firms, quite important. Then the last in the last couple of minutes or so that I have, I just want to say, I think where innovation, I want to circle back to innovation, where innovation I think comes in is not in small-scale firms, but in the markets and at a level up from those firms. And we want to think about private sector development and not just firms. A lot of the work that Eric talked about is based on access to markets, and it's based on foreign destinations and trade, and partly that's because that's where the data has been the best, and we've been able to sort of access those things. There's some that work, and again the paper that Eric discussed on small firms connecting to multinationals. Those attract our attention, but they're a pretty small share of the small firms in the country, and it's likely always to be a relatively small share. So instead, most small firms trade in domestic markets, and I think some of the most exciting work in this area when we think about private sector development and domestic markets is the work that's going on market structure in these economies, and I think particularly the work that Lauren Bergquist is doing, maize markets in Kenya, the level of sort of detail of a given sector in firms that Vittoria Bassi and all have done, and again others in that space, and then also markets as they relate to incentives for quality, and again domestic markets. So you know there's Jibai's work, and then an ongoing project on coffee, and that Jibai and others have done, and some work that I'm doing with Julia Cajal and Laura van der Waal on quality. So the last thing that I'll say, I'm out of time, is I think again this was brought up earlier, but the technology platforms, the business-to-business sourcing, and payments. So when we talked about digital finance before, the concern was there could be side selling, but the digital infrastructures out there is on both the demand side. That is, point of service terminals will tell me what my revenues are, but the B2B sourcing is telling me what my supplies are. And I have two sort of points to kind of to try to sort of map revenues of companies and avoid side selling. So I'll stop there. I think that, again, you know, what we're really missing in the literature is more of a focus on these VCPE ready funds, ready firms, or firms that are just a step below them that might become more growth oriented. They're not very common in the economies. They're harder to find. They're not big enough to do a study just on a single firm or a couple of firms. And so from a research perspective, it's challenging. I think this is a place where the VAT data and other local data may be quite important. So anyway, I'll stop it there. I think it's an exciting time in the area. We've done a lot with exporting. I think we need to do more with domestic markets. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. And now, Johannes, please. 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for an amazing conference. It's fantastic to be here. And so Eric and Chris gave great overviews of work focusing mostly on sort of within firm themes. So I will try to focus more on what we might call sort of the architecture that connects firms to other firms, to the state, and to their workers, right? This is an area where, as you'll see, I don't know if the others can better judge if this means it's a research frontier, but this is an area where most of the work I'm going to cover is really within the last 5 years. So it's fantastic to see, you know, firms in development on the PhD syllabi now and so on. And I think this is one of the promising areas to focus on. Okay, so I'm going to have 3 slides on linkages between firms, and then 1 each on firm state and firm worker links. So when we think about linkages between firms, in some sense, the natural place to start is the boundary of the firm itself, right? So you can integrate your suppliers, or you can keep them external to the firm, and so on. I should also say, by the way, before I jump in, despite firms in development now being a rich literature, it's still quite thin in a sense. So it's difficult to do honor to Chris and Dean's point about, you know, heterogeneity across space and not putting too much weight on any single study and so on. So we need more. I think one of the exciting findings in this area is that the boundary of the firm, which is usually not thought of, it's usually something we think of as sort of a, you know, fixed line, is in fact quite porous in many poor country settings. There's extensive sharing of machines and equipment across firms, work from Vittorio Bassi and co-authors, and also from Canedo and Kala from India, where it's more of a rental market. Anderson McKenzie, that Chris also mentioned, suggests that in Nigeria, functions that we think of as quite core functions of a firm, like marketing and so on, it can make sense to insource or outsource rather than sort of do it within the firm. This paper that Eric of mine that Eric also talked about suggests that, you know, it shows that if you want to upgrade quality, you may need to integrate your suppliers in order to control their incentives. But in some sense, the flip side of that is also that if the firm is instead trying to produce large quantities, right, sort of the opposite of focusing on quality, it can be cheaper to buy inputs on the open market, right? So that I think is sort of and I really like that about, you know, we're learning this from organizational economics and so on, that, you know, what the optimal strategy depends on the objectives in some sense. Lorenzo has new work in his case in the context of land markets on frictions around frictions that influence things like mergers across small firms. Morgan Hardy and Jamie McCaslin has similar work in the context of small textile producers in Ghana. Right? They study a cluster where all of the firms seem to be doing the same thing, and we always ask, why don't the more productive firms in this cluster kind of swallow up the smaller ones, and so we can see growth. They directly measure, they ask these small producers, what would you need to be paid to work for your neighbor instead of running your own firm? It turns out people are actually quite interested in that, and they're especially interested in finding out about which of their neighbors they might kind of swallow up. And then there's also exciting work on what are the actual frictions that are preventing this from happening. I'll try to highlight some questions that I think we need more work on. It's by no means comprehensive. In this literature to me is in some sense a little bit static. We don't yet know much about how important cooperatives are. Is this in some sense a snapshot of what production looks like in these settings? Or is it actually, I think, like cooperatives, sharing machines and so on, important for the longer term process of growth, in a sense, right? That is something I think we don't know much about yet. I also think that from a theoretical perspective, we need to figure out what's the entity that we should model here in some sense. Are the small producers sort of individually optimizing, subject to social norms and constraints in the neighborhood and so on? Or should we really be thinking of the entity as sort of a collection of firms? And that's what we should model. Okay, there's also been, second sort of sub-literature is on what within country trade looks like. Dave, of course, a pioneer in this literature, Lauren also. Trade costs are high in developing countries, intermediaries. So I should say that this is an area where we really, almost all of what we know is from agriculture and retail, right? Those are obviously very important, but they are a slice of the economy still. But in those two sectors, intermediaries seem to capture big parts of the kind of the benefits of globalization and so on. And there are often many intermediaries along the chain. This nice paper from Grant and Starts points out that those intermediaries are not just sort of bottlenecks, but also in some sense bridges to accessing markets, right? They help you get access to inputs, they help you in some cases export and so on, so that's important. VAT data is allowing new studies in which you can get a picture of the entire formal economy in the country, right? So these are two different studies. One is, my co-author Alan Griffith and UAU and I are using VAT data from Uganda. Peter Chacha and co-authors are using similar data from Kenya, sort of describing what the network of trade looks like within those countries. One thing that was surprising to me, for example, was that despite the fact that very few firms import foreign inputs, the large majority of formal firms actually use inputs that originate abroad. So perhaps an indication that firms in Uganda and Kenya are a little bit less isolated than we usually think about them. But also they're subject to considerable market power from those importers, right? So it might be, you typically see firm-to-firm networks in rich countries being sort of denser. So maybe we should think about ways to sort of make the firm-to-firm network denser in poorer countries also. One way to do that seems to be, at least this new paper, very nice paper from Demir and company from Turkey, suggests that internet technologies is one way to do that. So that paper shows very nicely in the Turkish setting that fast internet increases links between firms. It allows firms to find more and better suppliers, and with pretty substantial effect on average incomes in the districts. I think they find an increase in average incomes of 2% in the median Turkish district. So not as big as roads, but still pretty important, and a lot comes through firm-to-firm links. That's a the paper that mine I have up here is a literature review on internet infrastructure in developing countries. I think we need more on what these networks facilitate and what they hinder, especially on sort of types of production. Is where you happen to be located in South Africa or Kenya sort of constraining what you can produce because of what the network looks like, for example. Some relationships are special. Abhijit and Esther and Chris are sort of pioneers in this work on what we usually call relational contracts. Contract frictions are obviously extremely important in developing countries, and relational contracts can help overcome those frictions in some cases, could in some cases even help you to export. It doesn't seem to always work. There are also studies showing sort of the limitations of relational contracts, and it could also be collusive. I think we need more on where those relationships kind of come from. It's a little bit, the only papers that have really sort of dug into that essentially say that it depends on market structure and market conditions, which feels a little bit sort of circular in a sense. One of the areas, this has come up many times already in this conference, but kind of a sub-literature that I'm especially excited about. So these papers, Eric also talked about the Amit's paper. Claudio has a very nice paper related to this also, and Dave. Essentially, if you think of sort of contract drops, if you will, and then follow those small firms to see if they're able to follow through and actually supply governments and large large companies. There are strong indications that oftentimes they are, right? And I just find, trade people are excited about Amit's paper because of the learning curve, and that's also important. I think this is extremely exciting for two other reasons. One is, what does it tell us about the size of the frictions in the global economy, right? Like, how many firms are as capable as the suppliers that are in the status quo supplying these fancy furniture stores in Manhattan, right? Maybe we should think of, economists love to rank things, maybe we should think of like a step function where on each step there's like a massive number of firms that are essentially equivalent in terms of underlying productivity. And the second is that I think this opens up some interesting thinking about policy design, right? Like demand-side policy is much more feasible than going in and sort of figuring out how to make a firm more productive. The paper of mine that I list here is one in which, so we discovered that it's pretty common in public procurement for even very simple contracts to require small firms or any bidder on the tender to fill out 350-page forms that are extremely complex. And so we knew of work from the US, for example, on like college aid, and that shows how exclusionary, to disadvantaged individuals are excluded from opportunities because of those types of barriers. And it turns out that this is also the case. We find a little bit in line with the gung-ho evidence that has been discussed. We find that about a quarter of firms in Liberia, this is an RCT in Liberia, if we simply teach them how to bid on these large contracts, there's nothing about productivity. It's essentially only how do you fill out the form in a good way. They win much larger contracts, they win contracts from large buyers, and they do so not only a year later, but also 3 years later. So I think that's exciting. There's also sort of a little bit the other side of this, the other side of these sort of special relationships is there is also we're starting to see more evidence of situations in which trade appears to be more fluid. So Claire Balboni is working on a new paper where climate shocks knock out, for example, roads in Pakistan, and in her setting, it seems to be the case that firms can switch over to other suppliers very seamlessly. So they infer that this is going to be a problem in the future, and they can switch over to source from other settings. Bernard et al. is ongoing work on the closure of the Rwanda-Uganda border, which, there's a lot of trade across that border, but when it shut down, it seemed that firms were sort of able to substitute pretty seamlessly. We also find surprisingly sort of seamless substitution in Uganda across foreign and domestic inputs. I need to speed up a little bit, so let me skip some things. Firm-state relationships, I think, is an area where we know much less. Eric mentioned the new, or the, let's say, revised interpretation of evidence on industrial policy. I think this is very, very exciting. Korea, perhaps the fastest and most incredible economic sort of growth takeoff that we know of. The industrial policy seems to have played an important role. So we need to study this. There's also good evidence on kind of bad relationships between states and firms, where sort of two-way favor exchange and so on. I think is this because of assortative matching? Do we see sort of bad firms somehow setting up shop where they can sort of serve the autocrat and the other way around? This nice paper from Costa Rica by Diana Van Patten and her co-author looks at the United Fruit, so it's one of very few examples we have of these very large companies. The paper has lots of interesting findings, but one of them is that in some sense United Fruit was kind of doing the job of the state, right? It was building public schools and so on. What are the causes and consequences of this? I think industrial policy is something I find especially exciting because we don't really know if manufacturing is going to play the role in future economic development that it did in the past. Right? This is a very controversial topic that people have strong views about. But I think it's fair to say that today's economy is more service-based, even in developing countries. It's more digital and so on. So how do you do industrial policy in today's world? I also think we need more on multinationals. Multinationals are an exciting thing for development economists to study for a number of reasons. They have the technology, so they could presumably go create, set up factories and create jobs in developing countries. But almost all of the work we've seen on it has been on wages as an outcome, right? So I'd like to see more on job creation, but also sort of, potentially adverse impacts of multinationals. Eric has a nice new paper on companies, American companies shipping harmful batteries to Mexico. I think environmental impacts of multinationals is something that should be studied more and so on. Okay, final slide, firm-worker relationships. There's a nice new growing literature studying what we might call sort of bilateral relationships between firms and workers. Esther mentioned yesterday the paper from Maki and Stalder on how both workers and firms really sort of value work. The Hardy paper, they show evidence that individual workers spend their own money on technology that they can use at their workplace. Bassi et al. Is also on sort of self-employment within the firm. I think we need to be a little more open-minded about the objective function that firms might have and their decision-making and so on, but I don't yet have a good sense of how this sort of fits in the traditional models of growth and so on. Power is also something where I think we can learn a lot from the labor economics literature. You're starting to see nice papers now on concepts like dignity, like what are jobs that involve dignity. There is good evidence quite clearly suggesting that foreign involvement, foreign buyers and so on, seems to improve working conditions in developing countries. There's also evidence suggesting that monopsony power is perhaps even greater in developing countries than in rich countries. But I don't think we know very much on, for example, how you promote good jobs through local institutions. So lots of exciting areas of work to work on going forward. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Eric, Chris, and Johannes. The floor is now open. I know we are standing in between your lunch. Yes, Pascalina.
Thank you. So this was very rich, talking about firms. But when I think about development, I think about the dearth of firms, the lack of firms. There are very few big firms. And in some contexts, like in South Africa, we were just talking with Doris this morning, there are actually also very few self-employed, surprisingly, very high unemployment rate and very few entrepreneurs, let alone Gango entrepreneurs. So I guess the title of your session was not firms, bracket, and the lack thereof, but I would love to hear what you think about what do we know of what are the barriers to, big firms existing, especially there is very little manufacturing, as I mentioned. And when I think about a country like Ghana that tried to do the one district, one factory, I mean, I've not heard updates on that. It doesn't seem to go too well. I don't know if anybody has studied that, but that seems to be really problematic that you try to just have one factory per district and you can't even do that. Do we know what are the barriers there? I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
3.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering about family firms. So nothing was said about the the makeup of family firms. Perhaps we know that this is an enormous number of firms. I think 60% of the companies listed on the JSE, for example, started as family firms in South Africa. And as an economic historian, most firms in history were family firms. So I was wondering, is there any kind of new research about family firms, perhaps kind of formalizing them in some way? How are they different? Why are they successful? Thanks.
Robin?
So I just wanted to kind of flip things around a little bit. So a lot of the systems change points that were made yesterday in many different contexts about innovation, particularly sort of towards greener stuff. It seems that often the originator of the innovation is in a richer country. So it's like, going to a poorer country. And how is that going to happen? I mean, you hear these sort of vague, we need to do it. But if you're talking about energy or EVs or whatever, the firms are not in these countries and they want the product, so is it going to happen in multinationals? But it's kind of flipping it around because typically, your Volkswagen example is going from Mexico to the US. We're kind of now going the opposite direction. And what are the mechanisms that will actually allow that to happen?
Claudia?
Thanks. Great session. I had a question wondering what do you think about when we talk about structural transformation, we used to talk, like Eric started, about industrialization. And we know that a lot of what's happening today now is towards services. And a lot of the data and a lot of the analysis that we do, and even like related to Pascaline's question about like the missing middle and all that, is really about manufacturing, right? And we know very little about services in developing countries. It relates to also the employment, what Oriana was talking about. So how do we think about services and it's linked to industrial policy as well? How do we think about industrial policy for services?
Leonard, and then you respond, and then we shall take this other side.
Just a very quick question. R&D investment, particularly by multinationals. I think there have been a lot of complaints about the fact that MNC are just dumps manufactured goods to developing countries, but don't enough investment in technology transfer. R&D investment are very low. Can you comment on that?
Thank you. You can choose who goes first, please.
Okay, I'll take a couple of things, maybe in reverse order again. R&D investment. I guess I don't know. I mean, so there are some papers about this. There are R&D investment in the data. Daniel Xu and others have a paper in China where they incentivize R&D investment, and they found that people relabeled a bunch of expenditures they were going to make anyway as R&D. No? And actually, I don't know that, and this is related to Robin's question also, I don't know that we'd expect the innovation to happen. It doesn't have to happen in the poor countries, right? The issue is going to be, I think, technology diffusion, right? How do we accelerate technology diffusion? And this idea, I think industrial policy often have the idea we need to be being innovative in ourselves, but with a narrow definition of innovation, which is patents and things. And I guess I would push towards having a different, which is it's okay for the innovation to be happening in Silicon Valley or wherever it happens, and then the question is how can we accelerate that innovation, including for green stuff. That's one. Yeah, Pascal, I mean, I'm not an expert on South Africa. My first trip to South Africa. I mean, the problem is not, in many countries, there's lots and lots of firms. They're just tiny and they're informal, right? So the question is not the problem, is, are there enough firms? I guess that the trade-off depends on how, what are the barriers to formalization, or how costly is it to be formal, right? And my initial impression is South Africa, it can be quite costly to be formal. And so that's, and also the enforcement is pretty good. And so that may be why we in front see these big seas of informal guys. You see unemployment and not so many firms. So what do you do about that? I think reducing the barriers to formalization is a good idea. I'm not sure that's going to. I think that gets a lot of attention. I'm not sure that's going to be pushing growth. To be honest, I think that it's likely to be kind of small potatoes. Last thing about family firms is so it's clear. I think sometimes people say, "Oh, family firms are bad." Transfer of management, ownership within firms is bad. But people don't think about what problems the family firm is solving, right? That you have a very weak regulatory environment. You need people you can trust, and so for that reason you keep things within the family in order to solve that sort of those contracting problems which otherwise wouldn't be solved. And so I think the family firms can outlive their usefulness, right, in the sense that maybe it would be good at a certain point to transfer to a professional manager, but I think this idea that like family firms are bad, we need to avoid them is just not understanding the problem that people are facing.
Can I borrow that?
Sure.
So yeah, my pen didn't work. So let me say a couple things on just a couple of these questions. First of all, on technology transfer and technology investment, I think this is a critical issue that we really have to think hard about, especially as it relates to climate, because as Europe and who knows, maybe the US at some point have carbon border adjustment mechanisms and so forth, if you get low carbon technologies that actually scale in those markets, it's going to make it even more costly to export from Africa and South Asia, and unless those technologies also get there. So I think that question of how you get the technologies to the south is absolutely first order and crucial, and going to become more so as we go forward. I agree with Eric. It doesn't have to be produced there, but we have to figure out ways to get it. Some of these are going to be. If you just think about intellectual property rights, there are lots of problems with the way we're thinking about climate in North-South. But if we develop technologies in the North and we charge intellectual property rights to get to the South so that they can not pay carbon border adjustment, I mean, come on, we have to do. So this is something we really have to think through. I think it's a really crucial point. Just on not enough firms, I'd go back to again. I don't know South Africa well enough to say anything about South Africa, but I think we need a lot more research and understanding where the sort of dynamic small-scale firms are gonna come from. Emmanuel Colonelli has some work that we funded through PEDAL. I'm quite anxious to see it. It hasn't shown up yet, but I hope it will. On business integrity and open accounts for small-scale firms, trying to convince them that this is what you're going to need when you get larger to be able to get access to credit. And you better start at the beginning with not trying to keep things off books and not trying to sort of avoid taxes, because it makes your books opaque and nobody's going to lend you money to scale. And I think that's part of the it starts all the way from that level. And going up in terms of getting capital in those levels. And finally, on just one comment on manufacturing services, there is quite a lot of work in India, in particular, on the service economy and business process outsourcing and sort of you know, so I think there's been less that I've seen in Africa, but there is work in that area in India.
Johannes?
Yeah, one thing on Pascale's question. So we have some recent evidence that middle managers, pretty broadly defined, cost the same basically across the world, including in developing countries. That I find that pretty stunning, and it makes me a little bit. Why aren't there then more colleges and universities and people training accountants and those like middle jobs in poor countries, right? Is there some kind of failure in the relationship between firms and states? Maybe that's something pushing back against multinationals being the ones who can create jobs because they can't somehow sort of convince the state that we need more colleges and so on. But I think that's the very interesting questions to study there. I think South Africa's high unemployment rate is one of the most interesting questions in economics. I think there are a few studies on it. They tend to be they're older and sort of blame the lack of an informal sector in South Africa. I think we need it's an incredibly interesting thing to look at. Claudio's question, I think, that's a huge question that we don't really have a clue, right? Can there be economic development in the future that's not manufacturing driven? I think Penny Goldberg and Danny Roderick have slightly opposite views on it. It's a very, very complicated question. I think we need to start chipping away at it for sure. I guess one of the things that come to mind for me is I think we in sort of rich countries need to at least work to, for example, giving access to services exports I think market access is a big thing to think more about and so on. But I don't think we really know. And I think it's crucial, right? There has to be jobs. Yeah.
Thank you. 3 more questions, yeah? Yes, please. Yeah, please.
I just had a quick question. Yesterday we had the talk about climate change and adaptations. Thank you very much. And we found out that countries on the African continent tend to be very vulnerable in other developing country settings. How are small firms, adapting to this? Is it an issue for them at all on the continent? I just wanted to get your take on whether climate change is an issue, and if so, how these small firms are adapting on the continent. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Just to compliment on some discussion, there is this growing literature about farms and automation and the robot use. Essentially, this literature, I think, taking place in developed countries. On what happened to workers when the farm automate. And then we come to poor countries, we have this serious problem of jobs. So even people fear that when the automation is there, then even the little job they have will not even be there, which is a little bit challenging. But also we know that the majority of our farms are family farms, as yesterday mentioned, where we don't have really big farms to accommodate all those employment opportunity. So I just want to ask Eric, what do you think that will happen in the coming years in this developing community where we have this accelerated technology adoption, digital adoption, but then when it comes to farm, which essentially creates jobs for people, we really don't have this clear picture of what's going to happen with our people in employment opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally,
Chris, both your talk and Emily's talk highlighted this fact that there's this heterogeneity where there's this right tail that has really high returns to capital, and maybe if those firms get capital, they can grow. And I was wondering what the panel's opinion is on, still, do we really think that's where growth is going to come from? Like, is your idea that there's this right tail that's going to drive growth, or is it like the Laporta-Schleifer view that actually the entire informal economy is just going to die out? Like, none of these firms are actually the ones that are going to drive growth, and you kind of need it to come from somewhere else. So I was just trying to get a sense of what your view is on the importance of that right tail versus just a little bit of a sideshow.
And finally, Andrew.
Okay, just to build on this question around the fact that we don't actually have a lot of middle-sized farms, right? Do these small farms at these gung-ho entrepreneurs and farms, do they actually grow to be big? Do we know that they grow to be big and mid-sized? Because that's a major issue, at least in Africa anyway.
Thank you. Eric?
Maybe to divide the questions, maybe I'll take the one that was directed to me first,
Okay.
Which is about firms and automation. Obviously, so this is not a new issue, no, automation. You go back to the new paper about, the telephone operators, right, got replaced by automatic switching systems, or bank tellers, or, so now it could be that this new wave of automation is going to be so large that it's going to displace large amounts of workers, and there's going to be massive unemployment. I'm skeptical of that. I don't think that, I would be very surprised if that happened. It could. I don't have a crystal ball. Maybe AI is going to do things that we can't imagine now. But my sense is that this is, that economies generally, generate demand for employment, and I would expect even now that to be the case. A bigger question is this one what Claudia was talking about. Is it going to be manufacturing jobs? Is it going to be service jobs? Is it going to be something else? But I don't think that somehow machines are going to be doing everything that people in developing countries would otherwise do. So I feel there's a little bit of alarmism in the literature about this.
Chris?
So yeah, so let me take the questions on small firms in the right-hand tail. I think I would say my sense is that Schleifer's right. This is not about growth. That doesn't mean that they die and it's not something we should pay attention to. I think those two things are not. That's not mutually exclusive. The one from an employment perspective, two from a sort of providing local services, providing local, the local economy. I think the small firms will likely continue to play a role as they do even in more advanced and higher income economies. But it's not likely to. But I don't. And then do we see anything? I think we see really kind of no evidence on a mass scale of these firms growing. And I would take David's paper on the UN competition, $50,000. Yes, there's some growth in employment, but it's not like it starts a process where they continue to grow. There's growth, and actually then there's a bit of a fallback over time. So they're still bigger than they would have been, but that's a massive size grant relative to the size of this firm. So if that's highly selected firms, right-hand tail kinds of firms. So if it's not happening at that scale, again, one paper, Dean's point taken, but if it's not happening with that kind of shock, it seems less likely to be happening. And finally on climate and small firms, I haven't focused on that. I think there is some work going on, but I don't know it. So I'm gonna have to punt on that question.
Johannes?
Just to Andrew's question at the end, I think the short answer is no. We don't have good evidence kind of tracing out a longer trajectory of like growth from like medium size and to bigger and so on. It'd be very nice to have more sort of qualitative case studies and so on on these things to kind of motivate empirical work. Yeah.
Hey, thank you very much for being good listeners, and join me to thank Chris, Eric, and Johannes. We shall kindly reconvene at 1:30. Thank you.